This video for Our Watch features interviews with Our Watch stakeholders. They are filmed with their head and shoulders visible. Graphic text is used to highlight the key messaging that is spoken. Words appear. Change the story. A shared framework for the primary prevention of violence against women in Australia. Our Watch Manager of Policy and Evidence, Dr. Emma Partridge, speaks.
Preventing violence against women is a long-term goal. It's social change, it's cultural change, and it's really generational and transformational change that we need. So it isn't going to happen overnight. To make that change, we need governments to fulfil their human rights obligations to women. We need them to fund and support prevention. We need them to do the policy and structural change. But we also need everybody else to play a part. Workplaces, individuals, communities, families, and sporting organisations. Everybody needs to work together, and Change the Story gives them the framework to do that, to bring together that long-term change that is so necessary.
Associate Professor at Queensland University of Technology, Dr. Michael Flood, speaks.
Change the Story is based on a rich body of evidence from 40 or 50 years of scholarship on domestic and sexual violence. And what Change the Story does is synthesise that. It kind of tells a coherent, evidence-based story about what we know, and Change the Story has put on the map a language of what it means to prevent domestic and sexual violence, of the drivers of those forms of violence, and the effective strategies we can use to prevent and reduce that violence.
Dr. Emma Partridge speaks.
What's encouraging is that we can now move the conversation on to how do we prevent that violence and what works in prevention and what kinds of strategies can we put in place.
Senior Policy Officer for Women with Disabilities Victoria, Jen Hargrave, speaks.
In my work, I use Change the Story in three main ways. The first way is to explain to people what drives violence against women and children. The second way I use it is to say that it's a national priority. And the third way I use it is to say that we all have a responsibility to do something about it.
Senior Policy Analyst and Family Safety Secretariat for the Department of Communities, Tasmania Government, Bridget Altham speaks.
It's also really important as part of our messaging to the broader community, because we really need that strong evidence base to help shift attitudes and behaviours in the community. So really using that Change the Story to think about those different settings and where we can best affect change in the Tasmanian community.
Dr. Michael Flood speaks.
I've used Change the Story in three ways. First, I've used Change the Story as a kind of manual for how to do primary prevention in talking to practitioners, in working with policymakers and so on. Second, I've used it as a source of evidence, a source of scholarship about what we know drives domestic and sexual violence and the strategies we know will help prevent it. And third, as an education tool. Here's a handy framework that identifies what you can do. Here's a good explanation of what drives those forms of violence.
Tangentyere Women's Family Safety Group Co-Coordinator Shirlene Campbell speaks.
Since we've started the Tangentyere Family Violence Prevention Program, we have been using the resources and the research from Our Watch to help us develop Mums Can, Dads Can and Girls Can, Boys Can, which is our primary prevention projects, so that these projects are grounded in research.
Dr. Emma Partridge speaks.
Well, the first edition is 5 years old now, and the second edition was a chance to update the evidence, review the evidence that's come out in that time and see what we can learn from that. So I'd point to two aspects that we've really expanded. The first is a focus on men as the perpetrators of violence against women and the harmful forms of masculinity that are driving that violence and underpinning that violence. And on the flip side of that, the need to really engage with men as part of the solution, to talk to men and boys about the harmful forms of masculinity and how they need to be a part of preventing violence against women. The second aspect is how we've woven in an intersectional approach in a lot more detail. So of course we're still focused on the way in which gender inequality is a key driver of violence against women. But we've talked a lot more about racism and homophobia and colonialism and so on, and how they intersect to drive violence against women.
Shirlene Campbell speaks.
Change the Story has helped us explain to people about gender equality being the key drivers of violence against Aboriginal women. Basically what we do is we talk about the colonisation. I mean, you know, people say colonisation is scary stuff to talk about, But it's also educating ourselves and educating the non-Aboriginal people as well, because this is our women and our girls and our children that we have to start looking after and making sure that they're having that respectful relationship as well.
Jen Hargraves speaks.
Change the Story talks about how all our prevention efforts should be inclusive of women with disabilities, and it talks about how we should prioritise high-risk population groups. We experience all the same types of violence as all women do, but we also experience additional forms of violence due to the disability discrimination we experience.
All aforementioned Our Watch stakeholders speak while looking directly at the camera.
Join us in creating a future
where all women and children
Can live free from violence.
Together, we can change the story of violence against women in Australia.
You can change the story too.
Words appear. Change the Story. Our Watch. End violence against women and their children.